In chapters 7 and 8, Reina digs into her visit to Iguala, focusing specifically on her time spent with her two grandmothers and her efforts to try to support her baby sister, Betty. Just want to quickly highlight a few things to think about here. In chapter 7, I want you to look for moments where Grande looks at her grandmother's poverty from a broader lens of systemic injustice, what sociologists would describe as structure. If you recall, in the article about agency we read, we learned about structures that can shape and limit agency. We also learned the power of individuals, even in the most desperate situations, to exercise some agency. But here I think we get a really good example of Reina Grande's growing awareness as a young college student of the nature of systemic injustice and how that informs life in Iguala and her grandmother's, her mother's life. I also want to draw your attention to the contrast that Reina is seeing between her life in Santa Cruz and her grandmother's life and her sister's life in Iguala. And the juxtaposition is dramatic and difficult for Reina to get a handle on, and it's part of what helps her understand the systemic nature of the injustice, the fact that her grandmother is trapped as much as Reina is fortunate to have privilege. So Reina's privilege at Santa Cruz, her grandmother's lack of it in her context, are both examples of Reina's increasing awareness about structure and systemic injustice. Finally, in chapter 7, let's think about Betty as a great example of Reina's increasing awareness of positionality. Think about the ways Reina carefully unpacks Betty's positionality, both in chapter 7 and in chapter 8. Looking briefly at chapter 8, there's a continued conversation about Betty. It kind of carries over, bridges the two chapters. But the big event in chapter 8 is Reina's visit to her father's mother, her grandmother Evila. That's a classic name, right, for the evil grandmother. And her story of being raised by Evila, and then her visit to her grandmother Evila just months before Evila passes away. And I think this is a fascinating time to think about two ideas we've mentioned in class. One is Reina's growing sense of empathy, learning to see beyond her own anger and frustration and try to see the world from the perspective of others, and also the paradox of agency. Look particularly at the end of the chapter for the way Evila, who was so terrible to Reina and her siblings, also positively shaped Reina and empowered her with some traits and some abilities and some determinations that empowered Reina too over the course of her life. So it's a classic sort of family and the paradox of agency, things that can simultaneously limit and advance our agency. So much going on here. So I hope you really can dig into chapter 7, 8, get lots of good ideas, always thinking now in particular about, hey, where might I take this into my paper? Okay, thanks. See you soon.